The sun was setting over the wide and dusty plains of the American frontier, casting a golden hue across the sprawling ranch lands. The cattle moved lazily in the distance, their silhouettes blending into the horizon, while the wind carried with it the faint smell of sage and dry earth. For many, the ranch was a place of hard work, discipline, and survival. But for the people who lived and labored there, it was also home. Among them was a woman who had long been the heart of the ranch's kitchen, the cook who fed not only hungry ranch hands but also the weary traveler who might stumble upon the place seeking shelter. She was a widow, respected for her resilience and admired for her skill. Her cooking wasn't just food, it was comfort, a reminder of warmth and family in a world where loneliness often hung heavy. But time and hardship had worn her down, and lately she had grown weaker. What once had been her steady strength now faltered. The long hours, the endless work, and an illness that clung to her like a shadow were draining the life from her. The ranch depended on her, yet there was little she could do. She would cough into her apron, struggle to stand at the stove, and push herself far past her limits, but the truth was undeniable. She could no longer keep up. The ranch hands began to worry. Even the rancher, a quiet man of few words who rarely revealed much about himself, noticed her decline. But while many saw only the failing health of the woman, her daughter saw something more, a call to step forward. The girl was young, perhaps no more than 15 or 16, slender from years of living lean, but with eyes that carried the same determination as her mother. She had spent her childhood in the kitchen, watching, learning, and occasionally helping when her mother allowed it. Yet, she had never been the one responsible for the meals that kept the ranch running. Now, with her mother bedridden, the girl stood in the threshold of the kitchen, staring at the heavy iron pots, the sacks of flour, the cuts of meat hanging in the pantry, and the long wooden table where the men expected hot meals 3 times a day. The responsibility was crushing. A dozen hungry men could turn restless if their food was late or poorly made, and a rancher with high standards might not forgive mistakes easily. The girl's heart pounded with fear, but also with a spark of resolve. She could not let her mother down. She could not let the rancher send them away. Their livelihood, their shelter, and even their dignity rested on her young shoulders. She tied her mother's old apron around her waist, rolled up her sleeves, and stepped fully into the kitchen. Meanwhile, life on the ranch pressed on outside the kitchen walls. The men came in from the fields dusty and tired, expecting their evening meal. The rancher himself, though solitary and known to be distant, carried his own unspoken burdens. Years of isolation had made him wary of attachments, yet something about the girl's courage, her quiet determination, and the way she reminded him of the strength her mother once displayed, stirred a flicker of interest in his heart. The introduction to this story is not simply about a girl cooking. It is about the crossing of paths, the moment when hardship forces a child to grow up faster than she should, and when a lonely man, hardened by the silence of the plains, begins to notice the courage that blooms in unexpected places. It is the beginning of a journey that will test both of them, challenging their endurance, their faith, and perhaps even their capacity for love. And so, the ranch's story shifts. The girl takes her first hesitant step into her new role, unaware that this very moment will alter the course of her future forever. The kitchen, once her mother's domain, now felt like a battlefield to the young girl. The clanging of pots and the hissing of the stove were no longer just background sounds. They were challenges waiting to test her inexperience. She had seen her mother handle it all with ease, kneading dough while stirring a pot, slicing onions, while keeping an eye on bread in the oven. But to her it felt overwhelming. The ranch hands were no small audience. A dozen hardened men, weathered by long days under the sun, had appetites as big as their tempers. They wanted hearty meals, thick stews, fresh bread, salted meats, and steaming coffee that could keep them going from dawn till dusk. Anything, less would be met with mutters, complaints, or worse, outright anger. And now, a girl barely grown, who still carried the softness of youth in her face, was tasked with satisfying them. Her first morning alone in the kitchen began before the rooster crowed. She lit the fire with trembling hands, nearly burning herself, on the match. She measured flour too carelessly, spilling some across the counter, and the bread dough turned sticky under her clumsy kneading. Her heart thudded each time she imagined the ranch hands sitting down at the long wooden table, waiting for her food. When the men finally gathered, the meal was plain: burnt biscuits, runny eggs, and weak coffee. The ranch hands exchanged looks, some smirking, others frowning. One man, rough in his tone, muttered, "This ain't no meal fit for working men." The words cut deep. The girl bit her lip, fighting the sting of tears, and forced herself to clear the plates with her chin held high. Her mother, lying weak in bed, tried to reassure her when she later confessed her failure. "Don't be discouraged, child," she whispered, her voice frail but steady. "Cooking isn't just about food, it's about heart. You'll learn, step by step." But the girl felt the weight of more than cooking lessons on her shoulders. This was survival. If she couldn't manage, the rancher might send them away, leaving them with nowhere to go. That evening, she tried again. This time, she remembered the small details she had once overlooked. The way her mother always sprinkled salt into boiling water, the way she tested bread dough by pressing it lightly with her fingers, the way she stirred slowly, patiently, instead of rushing. The results were not perfect, but they were better. The stew had flavor, the bread was edible, and the coffee was stronger. Some of the men nodded in approval, though a few still complained. It wasn't just the food that wore her down, it was the loneliness of the task. Her mother had once filled the kitchen with laughter, stories, and gentle scolding. Now, the girl worked in silence, the only sounds being the bubbling of pots and the echo of boots outside. She carried her mother's sickness like an invisible weight, knowing that every meal she cooked was not only for the men of the ranch, but also for the woman resting in the small room at the back of the house. The rancher, though quiet, had begun to notice. He observed her struggle without interfering, as if testing to see whether she had the grit to endure. He saw the smudges of flour on her cheeks, the dark circles under her eyes, and the way she pushed herself long after she should have rested. There was something in her determination that reminded him of a younger version of himself, forced by life to grow up too fast. Each day the burden grew heavier. Yet with each meal, no matter how imperfect, the girl gained a little more confidence. She was beginning to understand that feeding the ranch wasn't just about filling stomachs. It was about earning respect, about proving she could stand in her mother's place. The burden was immense, but deep inside, she carried a quiet strength, waiting to reveal itself. And though she didn't know it yet, the rancher's watchful eyes were beginning to see that strength. The days passed slowly, each one blending into the next, and with them came the girl's first real tests. What seemed simple when her mother did it became mountains of difficulty when left to her alone. Cooking for one or two was one thing, but feeding a dozen ranch hands, men who returned from the fields with endless appetites and little patience, was a trial that pushed her beyond her limits. Her mornings began before the sun's first light. The kitchen fire had to be lit before dawn, water drawn from the well, bread dough started, and coffee brewed strong enough to wake even the sleepiest cowboy. More often than not, her dough refused to rise, the beans burned to the bottom of the pot, and the coffee came out either too weak or too bitter. By the time the men shuffled into the dining room, dusty from the corrals and ready for food, she was already exhausted. Their reactions were rarely kind. "These biscuits could break teeth," one man grumbled one morning, holding up a rock-hard piece of bread. Another pushed aside his plate with a scowl, muttering that he'd rather chew leather than eat her tough meat. Some laughed, Others rolled their eyes, but all of them left her cheeks burning with humiliation. She wanted to scream, to defend herself, but she swallowed her pride and bore the criticism in silence. When the kitchen was empty, she would sink against the wall, her small hands trembling with frustration. Her mother, too ill to rise from bed, could only offer words of comfort. "It takes time," she whispered when the girl came to her in tears. "I wasn't perfect when I began either. The men will see your effort, if not today, then tomorrow." But tomorrow always came too quickly, and with it, another round of mistakes. She sliced her hand trying to chop vegetables, spilled boiling broth across the stove, and once nearly set fire to a dish towel. The kitchen, once her mother's place of warmth, had become a battlefield where every pot, pan, and recipe seemed determined to defeat her. What made it worse was the weight of being underestimated. To the ranch hands, she was just a child, too small, too soft, too inexperienced to carry such a responsibility. Their doubt settled heavy on her shoulders, feeding her own fear that perhaps they were right. The rancher, however, saw things differently. He rarely spoke, keeping his distance as was his habit, but he observed quietly from the edges. He noticed the way she refused to quit, even after failure. He saw her dragging sacks of flour twice her weight, fumbling yet determined, and rising. Before everyone else, though, exhaustion painted her face pale. He remembered his own youth, when he too had been forced into a role he hadn't been ready for. Something about her reminded him of the way the West itself shaped people, hard, fast, and without mercy. Still, his silence offered her no comfort. To her, he was just another judge, waiting to see if she would break. She longed for one kind word, one sign that she was not failing entirely, but the rancher remained unreadable, his face carved from stone. Her struggles weren't only with cooking, they were with loneliness. The laughter of the men at the table often turned sharp at her expense, and without her mother beside her, the kitchen felt hollow. At night, when the ranch quieted and only the wind whistled through the plains, she lay awake wondering if she was strong enough to continue. But even in her doubt, something within her refused to yield. She clung to her mother's words, to the lessons she remembered from years of watching her at the stove, and to the faint spark of determination that had pushed her into the kitchen in the first place. Her first struggles were bitter and painful, but they laid the foundation for what was to come. Every burnt meal, every harsh word, and every tear shed in the empty kitchen was shaping her, not into the girl she had been, but into the woman she was slowly becoming. And though the road ahead would not be easy, fate was already stirring, waiting to test her in ways she could not yet imagine. The rancher was a man of silence. His words were few, his presence steady, and his reputation built on years of hard labor and quiet endurance. To the ranch hands, he was more a figure of authority than a companion. They respected him, even feared him at times, for he had little patience for idleness or excuses. But behind his stern exterior was a loneliness he never admitted, one that lingered in the corners of his large but empty house. He had noticed the girl long before anyone realized. While the ranch hands complained about the meals, laughed at her mistakes, or doubted her ability, he watched with a different set of eyes. To him, the girl's presence in the kitchen was not weakness but grit. He saw her dragging herself out of bed at dawn, fumbling with flour and fire, determined to learn what she did not yet know. He saw the burns on her hands, the smudges of soot across her cheeks, and the way she tried to hold back tears when the men mocked her. Unlike the ranch hands, he understood what it meant to be thrown into a role too soon. His own youth had been spent much the same way, thrust into responsibility before he was ready, forced to endure the weight of a world that did not wait for him to grow. The sight of her reminded him of himself, and though he said nothing, it stirred something inside him. At supper one evening, the men once again grumbled over the food. "The beans are too salty," one complained, and this bread's as tough as saddle leather." The girl stood in the doorway, her face flushed with shame. She lowered her head, waiting for the rancher's verdict, for he alone had the authority to decide if she stayed or was sent away. The first few weeks felt like a storm she could barely weather, but slowly, almost too slowly for her to notice at first, the girl began to find her rhythm. The kitchen no longer seemed like a monster waiting to devour her. The stove's heat, the chopping board's rhythm, the timing of bread rising and stews simmering, these things began to feel less foreign and more like pieces of a puzzle she was learning to solve. Her first true victory came one chilly morning. She had risen extra early, her hands still clumsy but more confident as she mixed the dough. She remembered her mother's words about patience. Let the dough breathe before you shape it. She covered it with a cloth, tended the fire, and returned just in time to see it rising properly for the first time. When the biscuits came out of the oven, they weren't perfect, but they were golden instead of burnt, soft instead of hard. At breakfast, the ranch hands bit into them with surprise. One man, usually quick with complaints, muttered, "Not bad." Another, chewing slowly, gave a grunt that wasn't quite praise but wasn't criticism either. For the girl, it felt like applause. She kept her face steady, but inside her heart swelled with pride. These small victories continued in quiet ways. The coffee she brewed grew stronger, closer to the rich taste the men preferred. Her stews began to carry more flavor as she learned how to season them with care rather than guesswork. Even the rancher's silence seemed to shift. Though he still spoke little, she sometimes caught the faintest nod of approval when he tasted her food. The rancher had always been a man of walls, silent, distant, and unyielding. His life had been spent among cattle, dust, and the hard edges of survival. To most who worked under him, he was nothing more than the stern figure at the head of the table, the one whose approval or disapproval shaped their days. Yet, as the weeks passed, something inside him shifted. It wasn't sudden, but rather like the slow thaw of ice beneath a spring sun. And the cause of it was the girl in the kitchen. He watched her quietly, never making his thoughts known. But the small details did not escape him. The way she stumbled under the weight of a pot twice her size, yet refused to ask for help. The way she wore burns and cuts on her hands like unspoken medals of persistence. The way she hid her tears, scrubbing dishes long after the men had left, as if the silence of the kitchen were safer than admitting defeat. At first, his gestures were almost invisible. One afternoon, noticing her struggling to carry a sack of flour, he wordlessly lifted it from her arms and set it on the counter. She froze, startled, unsure whether to thank him or fear his interference. When she finally whispered a timid, "Thank you," he only gave a curt nod and walked away. Another time, he noticed the stove's wood pile running low. Without being asked, he stacked fresh logs by the kitchen door. She discovered them the next morning, neatly arranged and ready, saving her the trip to the shed in the freezing dawn. She touched the wood pile with her hand, almost in disbelief. There were other moments, too. A spare lantern left lit near the kitchen when he saw her working. Late. A bucket of fresh water drawn from the well and placed by the door before she could fetch it herself. A steadying hand once when she nearly tripped carrying a tray of plates to the dining room. The men didn't notice these things, but she did. At first, she thought it was coincidence, or perhaps just the natural kindness of someone who saw her struggling. But as the gestures repeated, she realized the rancher was quietly watching out for her, not with words, but with actions. One evening, when the ranch hands were out late on a cattle drive, the house was unusually quiet. She was cleaning up the kitchen when the rancher appeared in the doorway. He stood there for a long moment, his presence filling the room. "You've done well," he said finally, his voice low and steady. The girl froze, unsure she had heard him right. Praise was something she had not expected, not from the ranch. hands, and certainly not from him. She looked at him, her eyes wide, and managed to stammer, "Thank you, sir." He nodded once, as though that was all that needed to be said, and turned to leave. But that single sentence lingered with her long after he was gone. It wasn't grand, it wasn't flowery, but it was real. Coming from him, it felt like the world itself had shifted, if only a little. Her mother, too, noticed the change. "He sees you," she whispered one night, when the girl brought her a bowl of broth. "Not just what you do, but who you are becoming." The girl blushed, brushing the thought aside, but in her heart, a warmth spread that she could not easily ignore. These moments of kindness were not just gestures, they were seeds. Seeds of trust, of respect, perhaps of something even deeper. Neither of them spoke of it aloud, but with each silent act, the bond between the lonely rancher and the determined girl grew stronger, as steady and quiet as the land they both lived on. And though neither yet knew it, those small acts of kindness would soon become the foundation for the great test that lay ahead. For a time, the ranch settled into a quiet rhythm. The girls' meals grew better with each passing day. The ranch hand's grumbles turned into silence, and the rancher's quiet support gave her the courage to press on. But peace, especially on the frontier, was never meant to last. The trouble began with whispers around the long wooden table. A few of the ranch hands, men hardened by years of rough living, were not content to let the girl's progress go unchallenged. To them, she was still just a child in an apron, and no amount of stew or bread could make her worthy in their eyes. "She's only here 'cause her mother was," one man muttered one evening, his voice low but sharp enough for others to hear. "We deserve better than half-baked meals and a girl playing cook," another chuckled. "Reckon the rancher's gone soft, letting her stumble around like she belongs." The word stung, though she tried not to let it show. She kept her head down, scrubbing dishes with trembling hands while their laughter echoed in her ears. The rancher said nothing that night, but his silence was heavy, his jaw set in a way that warned the men not to push further. Still, the seed of conflict had been planted. It grew worse when a rival cook, a woman from a nearby ranch, broad-shouldered and sharp-tongued, visited during a supply trip. She eyed the girl skeptically, then smirked. "This your new cook?" she asked the rancher, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Looks more like a kitchen maid than someone who can feed a crew." The girl's cheeks burned crimson, but she said nothing. The rancher gave only a curt reply. "She manages," and turned the conversation elsewhere. But the damage was done. The ranch hands began to compare her meals to what they remembered. From the rival cook's spread, richer stews, softer bread, seasoned meat that melted in the mouth. Doubt crept back into the kitchen like an unwelcome shadow. The girl's confidence faltered. Every dish she served felt heavier, every taste more uncertain, as if she were cooking not just against hunger but against the judgment of everyone around her. One night, after a particularly long day, she prepared supper with care: roast beef, potatoes, and cornbread. It was one of her better meals, but when the men sat down, one of them pushed his plate aside with a scoff. "Not fit for a ranch like this," he muttered. "We'd eat better over at the McAllister place." The words cut deeper than knives. She fought to keep her composure, but when she turned away to hide her tears, she caught the rancher's eyes. His face was unreadable, yet his gaze lingered, steady and firm, as if urging her not to break. Still, doubt gnawed at her. Could she really carry the weight of this responsibility? Or were the men right, that she was nothing more than a girl pretending to fill her mother's shoes? Her mother, frail and weak in bed, saw her distress. "Child," she whispered one evening, "the world will always doubt those who try, but you're stronger than you believe. Don't let their words turn you back." The girl held on to those, words, but the conflict had planted fear in her heart. The rancher's silence, once a comfort, now felt like a test. Was he still on her side, or was he beginning to wonder, as the others did, if he had been wrong to give her this chance? The days ahead would force the question to its breaking point. A trial loomed, one that would either prove her worthy or end her place at the ranch forever. The breaking point came with the cattle drive. For weeks, the rancher and his men had prepared for it, the long, grueling push of hundreds of head across dusty miles, with every hand working from dawn till night. It was the kind of task that tested not only the cowboys, but also the cook who kept them fed. Without hearty meals to sustain them, tempers would fray, energy would fade, and mistakes could prove costly. Traditionally, her mother had been the one to shoulder the burden of these drives, setting up makeshift kitchens in the open prairie, working tirelessly to keep the men fed. But now, too weak to leave her bed, it was the young girl's responsibility. The thought alone made her stomach twist. "Don't let them see your fear," her mother whispered before they left. "Cook with your heart, and the food will speak for itself." The morning of the drive, the girl climbed into the chuck wagon, her apron tied tightly, her small hands gripping the wooden seat. The men muttered among themselves, doubtful of her ability to handle such a task. "She'll never manage," one scoffed. "We'll be eating ash and leather before we reach the halfway point." She pretended not to hear, but the words sank like stones in her chest. The first day was chaos. The wagon jolted over rough ground, nearly spilling her supplies. Smoke from the fire stung her eyes, and her hands shook as she tried to stir pots while balancing against the wind. The stew burned on the bottom, the biscuits came out flat, and the men ate in silence, their disappointment heavy as the dust that clung to them. That night, alone by the fire, she wept quietly, certain she had failed. But when she looked up, she saw the rancher standing a few feet away. He said nothing, only handed her a canteen of water and gave a slow, steady nod before walking back to his bedroll. It wasn't comfort in words, but it was strength in silence, and it was enough to keep her from giving up. The next morning, she tried again. She rose before the men, kneading dough under the stars, while the camp was still quiet. She remembered every lesson her mother had taught her: to test the heat of the coals with her hand before setting the pot, to let the bread rise in a warm cloth by the fire, to stir the stew slowly and let it thicken on its own. By midday, the smell of fresh bread drifted through the camp, golden biscuits pulling apart softly in the men's hands. The stew, rich with beans, beef, and spices, warmed their stomachs. Even the coffee was strong and smooth. The men looked at one another in surprise, then dug in heartily. One grinned and slapped the table. "Now that's more like it." Each day after, she grew stronger. She learned to cook in the open wind, to balance pots over uneven fires, to stretch supplies further than she thought possible. The men's complaints turned into requests, their doubt into quiet respect. But the true test came at the end of the drive, when the rancher announced they would host a feast to celebrate the safe return of the herd. It would be the largest meal she had ever prepared: meat, bread, pies, and coffee enough for every man. Failure would mean humiliation in front of all. That evening, the camp was alive with firelight and laughter as she served platter after platter. The bread was soft and golden, the meat tender, the pies sweet enough to make even the gruffest cowboy smile. When the last plate was set down, silence fell. Not the silence of disappointment, but of satisfaction. Then, one by one, the men broke into applause, rough hands clapping against the table. The girl stood frozen, overwhelmed. Her face burned with pride, tears threatening to spill. Across the fire, her eyes met the rancher's. He didn't clap, but his faint smile was worth more than any cheer. She had done it. She had proven herself, not just as her mother's daughter, but as her own person, strong enough to stand against doubt, fear, and the weight of the ranch. The feast had ended, and the ranch hands slept soundly under the stars, bellies full and spirits lifted. The campfire had burned down to glowing embers, casting faint light across the quiet prairie. The girl sat alone on the wagon step, her apron, still dusted with flour, her hands sore from hours of work. Yet despite her exhaustion, a warmth filled her chest. For the first time since her mother had fallen ill, she felt more than survival. She felt pride. It was then that the rancher approached. His boots crunched softly against the dirt, his shadow long under the moonlight. He stopped a few feet away, hands tucked into his coat, and for a long moment, neither spoke. "You did well," he said finally, his voice low and steady. The girl looked up, startled. He had offered small words before, gestures of quiet support, but never something so direct. "Thank you, sir," she replied, her voice timid yet steady. He studied her for a moment, his eyes unreadable but softened by the fire's glow. "Not just well, better than many grown cooks I've seen. You kept this drive together, fed the men, fed me, that's no small thing." Her cheeks flushed, but she didn't know how to answer. She lowered her gaze, twisting the edge of her apron in her hands. The rancher shifted, as if weighing his words carefully. "I gave you one chance when your mother fell ill. Thought maybe you'd manage, or maybe you'd fail. But you didn't just manage, you proved yourself." He paused, then added, "And I reckon it's time I gave you another chance. A bigger one." Her breath caught. "Another chance?" He nodded. "You don't belong in the shadows of doubt, girl. You've got grit, same as any hand on this ranch. I want you to stay on, not just as a cook filling in, but as part of this place. Properly." The words sank in slowly, heavy with meaning. Until now, she had lived in her mother's shadow, carrying the burden because there was no one else to. But this was different. This was not obligation. It was recognition. It was opportunity. Tears welled in her eyes. "But I'm just me. A girl." The rancher's gaze was steady. A girl who kept this ranch alive when it could have faltered. A girl who stood up under the weight most men wouldn't bear. "Don't sell yourself short." His voice softened, almost a whisper. "Your mother gave us years of her strength. You've got her spirit. And more. You've earned your place here." For a long moment, silence stretched between them. The girl's heart raced, torn between disbelief and hope. To be seen, to be valued. It was more than she had ever expected. What about my mother?" she asked finally, her voice trembling. The rancher's expression softened further. "She'll always have a place here as long as she draws breath. And when she can no longer carry her share, you'll carry it for her. Not because you have to, but because you can." The girl swallowed hard, the tears spilling freely now. She nodded, her voice breaking as she whispered, "I won't let you down." The rancher gave the faintest of smiles, rare but genuine. "I know you won't." Then, tipping his hat, he turned and walked back into the shadows of the camp. She sat there long after he left, staring at the stars above. The ranch had once felt like a burden too great for her small shoulders. But now, with his words ringing in her heart, it felt like a future, one she had earned, one she was ready to embrace. The rancher's chance had changed everything. The cattle drive ended, the herd brought safely home, and the ranch slowly returned to its steady rhythm. But for the girl, everything had changed. What had once been a burden pressed upon her shoulders had become a calling, a path forward. She was no longer simply the sick cook's daughter filling in. She was herself, capable, tested, and proven. Her mother, though frail, watched with pride as her daughter moved through the kitchen with confidence. Where once there had been clumsiness, there was now skill. Where once there had been fear, there was now certainty. "You've grown," her mother whispered one evening as the girl carried in a tray of food. "Not just taller, not just older, but stronger. You're becoming the woman I always hoped you'd be." The girl held her mother's hand tightly, tears shimmering in her eyes. "I only did what I had to," she said softly. Her mother shook her head with a weak but knowing smile. "No, child. You did what most would not. That makes all the difference." Outside, the small room, the ranch, bustled as it always had. The men returned from the fields, dusty and tired, but now, when they sat at the table, there were no mutters, no complaints. They ate heartily, sometimes even praising her meals with nods or small grins. She had earned their respect, not through words, but through persistence and the food that kept them going day after day. The rancher remained as steady and quiet as ever, but something between them had shifted. His glances lingered longer, his silences less distant. He no longer looked at her as a burden he had allowed out of pity, but as someone who belonged. She felt it most in the little things, in the way he carried in a fresh sack of flour without being asked, in the rare but meaningful words of praise he spoke when her meals impressed even him, in the subtle warmth that had begun to melt the edges of his solitude. One crisp morning, as the sun rose over the horizon and painted the plains in gold, the rancher found her stacking wood by the kitchen door. He stopped, watching her with that steady gaze she was learning to read. "You've done more than fill a place here," he said finally. "You've made it your own." She looked at him, her heart quickening. "I only did what was needed," she replied. His expression softened, almost a smile. "That's what makes you needed." The words sank into her like sunlight. She realized then that the chance he had given her was not just about cooking. It was about life, about the kind of future she could build with her own two hands. The days rolled into weeks, the weeks into months. Her mother's health remained fragile, but the girl had grown strong enough to carry the weight. The kitchen, once a place of fear and failure, had become her kingdom, filled with the smells of fresh bread, rich stews, and the laughter of men, whose respect she had earned. And in the quiet moments when the rancher's eyes met hers across the dinner table, she felt the unspoken truth between them, that both their lives had been changed by that single chance he had given her. The ranch was no longer just a place of toil and loneliness. It was a place of belonging, of hope, of new beginnings. The young girl who had once stepped into the kitchen trembling was gone. In her place stood a young woman, strong, capable, and ready to face whatever lay ahead. And though the future stretched, wide and uncertain, she no longer feared it, for she knew now that she was not walking it alone. The rancher's single chance had altered her fate, and in turn, she had altered his. Together, they had found something rare on the harsh frontier. Not just survival, but a new beginning.